Welcome to the CII webinar on CSR, the New Law Education Series 3. If you all have any queries, you all can type on the dialog box as on your right in the questions column. Introducing Priya Nayak. Priya Nayak is a social entrepreneur and worked as a researcher at the Poverty Action Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, USA. Priya has a master's in economics from Yale University, USA, a master's in public policy from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, USA, and a master's in commerce from Mumbai University, where she stood first in the entire graduating class. She also holds a certificate in executive education from the Harvard Business School. Priya has worked as a consultant with the International Finance Corporation in Africa. She started her career in accounting at Arthur Andersen in Mumbai. Her career is an interesting fusion of on-the-ground grassroots solutions through enterprise and strategic consulting experience with established companies, a perfect combination for understanding and implementing CSR projects across the board. I now hand over to Ms. Priya Nayak to take it further. Should I wait for people to... Hello everyone, I'm Priya. I'll go a little slow in the beginning so that we give some time for others to join. You can go ahead and send me all of your questions. I'm happy to take questions while we're doing the presentation. I'm also happy to take them at the end. So we're getting a few questions already. Let me actually respond to those. So yes, the material will be circulated after the session. The next question is, do private limited companies come under this rule? Yes, they do. So as long as they qualify under, and we'll talk about which companies qualify and which don't in just a minute. So just to start with the session, I don't know how many of you attended the first two. Is it possible for you to quickly respond and tell me just a yes or no if you attended any one of the earlier sessions? Or if this is the first. So if you've attended any one of the earlier ones, just say yes. If you haven't, then just say no. Okay, I see that a lot of you have attended at least a few of the earlier ones. So let me go through very quickly through the first few slides because that's just a quick recap. Give me 1 second. Okay. So until very recently, there really has not been a definition that's been globally accepted. The ministry has proposed a definition as part of the Companies Act, which basically says that CSR is a process by which an organization thinks about and evolves its relationships with stakeholders. So for a minute, let's just look at the word stakeholders. I think until now, people viewed CSR really as its responsibility to society at large. But what the ministry or what the Companies Act is actually expecting us to do is to focus on our core stakeholders and ensure that we're meeting their requirements through a longer term engagement with them. And therefore the word commitment. So it's not something that you do once, but it really is an ongoing relationship that you maintain, a commitment that you make to society, which goes beyond just writing a check. So the Act is also asking us to ensure that our business processes and strategies are in line with societal good. And therefore, the Act is actually asking us to move away from the definition of CSR as just merely charity and more towards going on to become that okay? Can you hear me now? Okay, looks like we're back. Sorry about that. Okay, so I think when we got lost, we were just talking about the fact that this goes beyond charity and really talks about being a responsible business. So there was a question earlier which asked if foreign companies registered in India also qualify. So yes, they do. If they meet the requirements of the 5 crore net profit or the 500 crore net worth or the 1,000 crore turnover, then yes, they have to comply with this particular rule. Again, I'll just spend a few minutes talking about what companies need to do. The first thing that they have to do is to put in place a CSR committee. It needs to have at least 3 directors, one of whom needs to be an independent director. A CSR policy needs to be created. We'll talk a lot more about that in this presentation. The board has to approve the policy and therefore will be held responsible for whatever the company undertakes as part of its activities. We have to disclose the policy and therefore make it public. And anyone therefore has the right to come in and ask both the company as well as the board any questions regarding what their CSR activities are all about. They have to spend 2% of average net profit before tax. Whether it's net profit before tax or after tax should get clarified in the next few days. And all of the activities have to be reported at the year end as part of the CSR reporting framework, which has also been provided. So the Act has laid down several activities. There has been some discussion whether companies can fund projects beyond the list that you can see in front of you. We should get more clarity from the ministry soon. In the earlier drafts, they had allowed companies to also pick activities that went beyond the list. So, for example, art, culture, etc., could have been funded if the policy document laid it down. But again, like I said, I think we should get more clarity from the ministry very soon. What the rules actually require companies to do is to ensure that the benefits of whatever programs the company supports have to go beyond the employees and their families. And therefore, it really has to clarify for societal welfare. It can still be focused on your other stakeholders, so your communities, for example, but it has to be it has to really go beyond just employees and their families. So most of the session today will actually focus on how do you bring CSR to life. The earlier 2 sessions talked about the rules and how CSR is perceived globally, but this really is about once you decide, once you know that you have to comply, what are the first few steps that you actually take to get started. Now, across the world, there are varying definitions of CSR, and there's nothing right or wrong. It really is a fairly long path that starts with corporate philanthropy and ends really at sustainability. And, I've heard a lot of conferences where people say, well, sustainability is really what's most desirable and corporate philanthropy is just not effective. And I don't fully agree with that. I think that each company needs to decide what their definition and what their approach towards CSR is. And as long as you're moving towards sustainability, I think you're all right. Now, when you start with corporate philanthropy, so what is that really all about? It is when companies decide to focus on social welfare rather than immediate business gain. Having said that, companies still have the ability to do something very significant with their corporate philanthropy strategy. So as long as they are able to leverage their core competencies, their expertise to achieve whatever cause that they have supported, you can still see corporate philanthropy creating significant benefit. So for example, if you work for a pharma company, then picking a cause that's completely aligned with, let's say, your drug portfolio or the expertise that your employees have, you don't have to benefit from it in any way, but what you can contribute just by leveraging your core competencies can be very, very significant. And when the Act came in place, the one thing that we were very excited about is really the ability for companies to put in their core competencies, your kind of non-financial resources to really create transformation. And you can do exactly that with corporate philanthropy. What is strategic CSR? So strategic CSR is when you are trying to achieve both business as well as societal goals. The Act really talks about companies focusing more on strategic CSR rather than only corporate philanthropy. And what it basically says is that whatever you do needs to be aligned to business, and it is perfectly okay to actually reap the rewards of whatever it is, whatever cause that you're trying to support. What the Act also says in terms of strategic CSR is that you really engage your stakeholders. So it's not just the broader society that you keep in mind, but your immediate, your key stakeholders and what they expect from you. Going a step further, if you're able to engage them in your CSR activities, that's even better, because then it's, whatever you're trying to undertake is both aligned with what you are trying to do as well as what they are expecting from you. And over a period of time, it is always beneficial if the community that you're working for, the suppliers that you're trying to impact, or the vendors that you're trying to engage with, also develop a sense of ownership in terms of what you're trying to do. The other end of the spectrum is really sustainability, and we hear about Hindustan Unilever and a lot of other companies saying that it's not just about the 2%, but 100% of our business will be aligned with societal and environmental concerns, right? And whatever we do as a company cannot harm the society or environment in any way. While that is, sort of obviously the right goal to achieve, I think a lot of companies will find themselves on the path towards sustainability. As long as we're able to figure out where we are and where we want to go, that really is sort of the first step that you need to decide before you start any of your CSR initiatives. So we have a question which said, is corporate philanthropy something that we can't do anymore with the CSR budget? No, I mean, you certainly can. You can still be, that obviously still qualifies under what the rules say. Yeah, I don't see any reason why you can't practice it. And actually, a lot of companies that we talk to prefer to focus on corporate philanthropy because they say, look, we don't want anyone turning back at us and saying, hey, you're supporting education because it benefits your business in some way. So I see a lot of companies that are very clear that they actually want to focus on corporate philanthropy and not really have anything getting mixed up with their day-to-day operations. The other question I'm seeing is, we can do both environmental and community initiatives under CSR rules. Yes, you can, as long as, so community initiatives, of course you can. In terms of environmental initiatives, these have to go beyond the other regulations that your company needs to comply with. So as long as it's the environment benefits are strictly for the community, all of that should be allowed. Okay, moving on, in terms of an operational structure. Okay, so there's one more question saying, what is the difference between CSR and creating shared value? So creating shared value is really when your entire business is aligned. So whatever CSR initiatives that you actually undertake are really part of your business strategy and part of your operations, and that's when your organizational DNA is really structured to also create value for society. It is a loose definition about what really constitutes creating shared value. So the impact under the current New Companies Act, again, I think what the Companies Act is really saying is that this is a very broad framework, and you can choose to be doing corporate philanthropy, you can choose to embrace the concept of creating shared value, you can ensure that your business operations are sustainable. So the Act allows you to undertake any one of those very different strategies. The next question is donations made to economically hit areas or cyclones will be covered in the CSR. Yes, they absolutely would be. Now, just in terms of how do you operationalize your structure, once you've figured out what your overall approach is, how do you make sure that you create the right institutional structure to deliver on whatever approach you've decided upon? So one is the board of directors. The second is the CSR committee that we talked about briefly, and the CSR committee would report to the board. It would have at least 3 members, one of whom would be an independent director. There would be an implementation group which reports to the CSR committee. The CSR committee is not necessarily the one that's implementing the programs on the ground. The implementation group itself can be made up of one task force, and again the task force is really made up of people who are responsible for implementing a CSR strategy, but also people who are really passionate about CSR. You know, very often when we talk to companies, we realize that that people who we just didn't expect to be interested feel very strongly about doing something for society. So, for example, the head of research. You know, no one expected the head of research in one of the companies that we work with to be kind of remotely interested. But when we started engaging with the senior leadership, we realized that this particular gentleman had very strong opinions in terms of what he thought the company should be doing. And therefore, if you have a task force that's made up of people who are responsible for implementing the strategy, but also people who just really care and have opinions, then that's sort of the ideal task force to have. The implementation itself can be done either by a CSR foundation, if your company already has one, and if it's been in existence for 3 years. It can be implemented by a CSR department, and again the CSR department can be made up of someone who's exclusively focused on CSR, so a CSR manager or a CSR associate, but it also could be people from other functional teams, so somebody from HR or from corporate communications. Or people who are part of, let's say, the manufacturing team, who could be designated to undertake certain CSR activities. Now, there are 2 kinds of people who could support your CSR team, whether it's the foundation or the department. One is champions. So these are enthusiastic, passionate volunteers that want to lead CSR initiatives. They've probably already done something within your company on their own or with the approval of the management team. But these are people who are just generally very, very enthusiastic and are willing to commit the time and effort to see activities through. The others are volunteers, people who still want to help, but maybe people who don't want to lead. But you know, these are people who will show up if the champions or if the CSR team actually asks them to help. And you know, having a mix of all of these, irrespective of how large or small your company is always very helpful. Just moving on to the next slide. If you think about, so going back to, you know, why you're doing CSR, the why, okay, so let me answer these questions and then I'll go back. So the first question is, any scope of NGO pitching in this operational structure? So yes, the NGOs really become your implementation partners and can also help you sort of undertake certain activities even within the company. So for example, NGOs could be used to engage employees and actually facilitate certain volunteering activities. Can the volunteers keep changing? Yes, they can. There's no requirement that there needs to be a certain set or a number of people. The rules actually don't say anything about volunteers. But it entirely depends on your company, and it depends on what approach you're taking. And if you think you like to engage employees in whatever CSR initiatives you're taking. And in most cases, we've seen you know, a very strong yes from both companies and volunteers wanting to get engaged. Is it mandatory to get engaged with an NGO? It's not. If you have a foundation, you can undertake activities through the foundation. But an NGO is recommended because, you know, this is not your core line of business. This is not what you're doing every day, and therefore to find specialist implementation partners to actually undertake some of your CSR activities is always a good idea. coming back to the stakeholders, once you decide what your overall broad approach is, it really is, the next thing to do is to figure out why you're doing this and for whom you're doing it. So who are your stakeholders? Are your stakeholders the larger society? Is it a specific community that you're trying to impact? Is it customers? Is it suppliers? In many cases, it's both people that you want to impact, but also people that you want to engage. So for example, if you run a cause-related marketing campaign, where you encourage your customers to donate to a CSR initiative that you're actually undertaking, that could be a great strategy to actually communicate to your customers what you're doing for society and ensuring that they become a part of it. And several studies across the world have shown that the customers view companies that actually take CSR seriously as kind of preferred brands that they would continue to support. So let me just take the next set of questions, which is there a separate set of rules if you're a foundation? No, there really are no rules. I think, again, we're asking the ministry for more clarifications in terms of what's allowed and what's not if there's a foundation in place. The next question is it mandatory to set up a goal for all of the employees to participate in CSR activities? No, nothing is mandatory. Again, it depends entirely on your company. We've seen companies where they will do whatever it takes to get their employees involved. They will provide a lot of incentives. Employees are given a day off or a few hours off. Employees' contributions are recognized in a public forum. And then there are other companies that think, this is all just a bit of a waste of time. But so, entirely depends on your company and what you think your employees want. The next question is, do the programs related to employees and employee family come in the CSR? So as of now, the last draft rules actually said that whatever money you spend on employees and their families will not be considered under CSR. But we're waiting for clarification. My sense is that clarification, that will probably state that you cannot spend money on employees and their families. But you can certainly engage them to just meet your CSR goals more effectively. And it really creates a good spirit. Your entire workforce becomes part of a movement that you're trying to create. So going back to the stakeholders, so one is to kind of identify who your key stakeholders are. Who do you want to impact? Who do you want to engage? Typically when we work with companies, the first thing we do is actually go out to the senior management and draw up a long list of stakeholders that the senior leadership thinks are important. We then take this list and narrow it down to maybe 3 or 4 that need to be engaged very quickly. And these again could be people that you want to engage with or people that you want to impact. Once you've identified who your 4 or 5 key stakeholders are, you should typically get down to figuring out, what are the issues that are on top of their mind. So what do they expect from you as a company? What are their thoughts about what you're doing or what you should be doing? And therefore, figuring out the right engagement plan. And again, depending on your stakeholder, the way you engage them could be very, very different. With employees, just employee-wide surveys or focus group discussions could be enough. With a community, you may want to go in and speak with the decision makers. You may want to do a household survey, a village level survey. You may want to speak with the people running running governance schemes in your area. So it depends on who your stakeholder is, and therefore your engagement strategy will really be determined by that. Once you've figured out what your broad approach is, which key stakeholders do you want to engage, and once you've heard from them about what they're expecting, at that point in time you can start deciding what your priorities should be. Again, in our experience, if you go and ask stakeholders, they want everything from the sun and the moon included. But it's also important to communicate to them that, at the end of the day, there are only a handful of issues that you will very realistically be able to address over the long term. and also having a focus in terms of which causes and issues you want to support is good, and it's good to communicate it to them so that their expectations are managed a lot better. Once you've decided which stakeholders and what priorities, at that point in time, it is a good idea to create a detailed plan and communicate it back to them. So to tell them, hey, this is what we heard from you. We've factored all of that in. We've thought about it. And we're just letting you know what we plan to do over the next 2 or 3 years. And we really welcome your support. So it is important to also make sure that there is some sort of an engagement plan so that they continue to work with you to achieve whatever objectives you've laid down. So we have a question now, which is, can the local government be one of the stakeholders? Well, absolutely. And it's always a good idea to actually support some of the work that the government has already put in place, so that your money also goes a long way. You're not spending money on infrastructure. You're not spending money on recreating anything that the government has already done. But instead, if you're able to spend your money in just strengthening what the local government has already put in place, that's an ideal approach. So this is, this is a slide that actually is relevant for all companies. With most companies that we work with, we tell them, think of one program, like a signature program that your company will become known for. So if you think about the Mahindra Group, Nanhi Kali as a program is sort of immediately, if you think about CSR in the Mahindra Group, the first thing that comes to mind usually is Nanhi Kali, because that's one program that they have adopted, the one program that they have supported over a long period of time, and they have really publicized it and championed and evangelized it. So, sorry, I think somebody is able to hear just music. Okay, all right. Can you still hear me? Because I think we're getting a few complaints to say that. Okay, can you just say yes? Oh, great. Okay. So a signature program is a good one. It usually is a holistic program. Thank you very much. That you will support over a long period of time. It should also be the one program that addresses most of the issues that your stakeholders have communicated to you. Again, if you're able to pick a program that you have some expertise and core competence in, then that's ideal. So like I said, if you're a pharma company, let's say you're manufacturing mental health, so drugs that are targeted towards mental health ailments, then picking mental health as a cause is really great, because a lot of your employees really understand it, your distribution network, your suppliers, the entire ecosystem that you've created understands the cause, and therefore gets in and sort of deals with it every day. And therefore, if you have a signature program that's aligned to what you're already doing, then you really can leverage a lot of the other networks and the expertise that you have to create not just a name for yourself, but really to create significant impact. Having said that, it's also perfectly okay to pick a cause that has nothing to do with your area of business. Like I said, Nanhi Kali has to do with educating the girl child, nothing to do with Mahindra's core competence, and yet, it's a program that they have done wonders with. Again, that's a good example of collaboration that the Mahindra Group has undertaken with other companies. So a lot of companies actually support the Nanhi Kali program, and as long as you're picking a cause that society knows is very beneficial, and if you're doing it the right way, then it's easy to get collaborators, and we actually very strongly recommend that as many people as are involved, the better it is. We also recommend that you undertake some planned projects. Now, these are typically projects that, again, a large number of your stakeholders expect from you, and something that you will commit to over a period of time. So let me take an example. So let's go back to the same pharma company. And let's assume that this company supports mental health as a cause, and that's their signature program. But as they start thinking about the communities that surround their manufacturing locations, they realize that most communities require two things. One is they require better education support for the children that are, let's say, going to government schools. And the second thing that the community is expecting from the company is better sources of, let's say, livelihood, because the entire, let's say, youth or the other population that's part of the community cannot be employed by this company and yet needs some means of livelihood. And let's assume that this is an issue that the company faces in all of its, let's say, 6 manufacturing locations. So what the company does is mental health becomes a signature program that they roll out across the country. But for each of the manufacturing locations, they take 2 programs, one in education, one in livelihood, that they roll out. And these are multi-year programs that the company supports. What the company can also do at this point in time is make it very clear that it will support the program for a certain period of time, and that over a period of time, it expects the community to take ownership of it. And that's actually a great way to get community buy-in, and also to ensure that you are not the one spending the money every single year, but there is some sort of a sustainable plan in place, particularly for as you start thinking about livelihood initiatives. There are a few that obviously cannot be sustainable, but there are others that can be. The one point that I want to make here is when you start looking at partners, one set of partners are NGOs, but another set of partners that could also be interesting are social enterprises. This is allowed by the CSR rules. And typically social enterprises are organizations that whose primary objective is social impact, but they usually have a business model to ensure that they themselves are sustainable. So this pharma company, for example, if it wants to set up a school in each of its 6 locations, or if it wants to set up a livelihood training center, then it can contract a social enterprise to actually undertake these activities with a mandate that the company will support the social enterprise for 3 to 5 years, and beyond that, they have to work with the community to make it sustainable. This also allows you to pick different causes over a period of time and not continue to just support one cause and one issue. It is a good idea to ensure that your planned projects have a very clear indicator of both short-term as well as long-term goals, for the simple reason that you are actually designing these programs to respond to what your stakeholders are expecting from you. So if it's a school that you've decided to support, then to ensure that you're communicating back to the community about, let's say, enrollment rates or retention rates or pass-out rates, or just students' performance year on year, or the kinds of opportunities that they've been able to access while in school or beyond school, it is a good idea to ensure that you're constantly communicating that to all of your stakeholders. The last set are really unplanned activities. So we normally recommend that any CSR budget gets split into a signature program. So let's assume 40 to 50% of your money really goes towards supporting that. Let's say another 30% goes towards supporting your planned projects. But it is important to keep a little bit of money aside to support unplanned activities. There will be situations where the communities that you work in come in and ask you for some money for something that's very, very critical to them. Let's assume a natural disaster has occurred, and therefore at that point in time, you want to be completely responsive to their requirements, and they'll appreciate that. Okay, so just going back to a few questions, can we spend from the CSR fund for publicity of CSR activities? So again, it depends on what you define as publicity. So if it's a large, let's say, media campaign, then no, that probably will not be allowed. But publicity which is required for the activities themselves should be allowed. So for example, let's say you're talking about an immunization campaign and you're supporting, let's say, a primary health care center where immunization is offered. And therefore, any publicity related to that specific project to get more enrollment, etc., should ideally be allowed. Okay, some examples of social enterprises. So Sarvajal, for example, is a social enterprise that offers purified water to local communities and actually works with local communities to set up a water purification plant. They also have a business model in place. So that a local entrepreneur can own and operate it over a period of time. That's one example of a social enterprise. There are others. So for example, there are companies that offer school curriculum or teacher training. All of these are again examples of social enterprises, but the primary motive really is impact and not profit. Will keeping aside funds within the organization or with a trust for anticipated activities qualify for CSR spend? So by the end of the year, you do have to spend the money, but it's okay to reserve a little bit of money towards the year end and report that, we had kept this money for kind of unanticipated events. But again, I think we should get more clarity from the ministry on that. But I think a very small amount of money that you can keep aside should be allowed. Okay, so the next question is, are sitting fees paid to independent directors appointed for CSR purpose, will be treated as CSR expenditure? I don't think so. I don't think that there's been any clarification on that, but if you can send me this question separately, I think we can get it checked. But my sort of immediate assumption would be that it wouldn't qualify. Can donation for betterment of roads at the outskirts? Well, so it again depends on, on the betterment of roads, right? So can you identify a specific community that will actually benefit from the road, or is it just going to be your company? So, again, it's sort of a qualified judgment. As long as you're able to say that a specific community will derive benefit amounting to, whatever, if you can quantify that impact, then I think it should be okay. But again, I think it is, if you have very, very specific questions, I think if you can just send it to me, and we'll try our best to see if we can get a clarification. Okay, so just moving on to the next slide. So a CSR policy. Now this is a very critical document because this really will define what you end up doing over the next few years. It is also your communication to the world in terms of what you plan to do. So the first component is really, what's your CSR philosophy, right? So this is the approach that we talked about. Are you looking at it as corporate philanthropy? Are you looking at it as sort of beyond that? And what are the values? So it really is like a vision and mission statement that you put out there. You have to specify the causes. Ideally, if you're able to specify the causes in line with the Schedule 7, that's sort of ideal. It's also helpful to list down all of the projects and activities that you plan to undertake during the year, but also how do you plan to execute it. So is it going to be done by an internal team? Are you going to seek NGO or social enterprise partners? Are you going to work with consultants? And what are the schedules for it? What are the timelines? What are sort of the deliverables that you're expecting? As part of the policy, you have to state that any surplus that you get from the CSR activity will not be counted towards business profit, and that any income that you derive from the net profits, etc., will be reinvested in the CSR activities. Now, on the left-hand side, what you really see is just what the Act has asked you to put in place as part of the CSR policy. On the right-hand side, so the blue boxes really say that if you want to go beyond the regulation, and if you really want to clarify this for yourself and for the public, then what should you do? So the first is figure out what is your definition for CSR and what does it mean to you? And every company can have a different definition, which is very specific to their line of business, the stakeholders that they are trying to address, the causes that they have picked, or the impact that they are trying to achieve. You should also list down who your relevant stakeholders are. And also, what are the tools and what is the policy for communicating back to stakeholders? Again, in our experience, we found that a lot of companies are actually doing a fair bit of CSR work, but they just haven't communicated it. So if you ask the general public, or you ask customers, the community, or employees, what do you think your company is doing? A lot of them just have no idea. And if you're already spending money, you might as well ensure that that people are engaged and people actually know about what you're doing. It is very, very important to put in place a monitoring and an improvement mechanism. So remember that the directors are held accountable for the CSR activities, and therefore you want to ensure that that whatever activities that you're taking on are being monitored closely. And that you're also seeking continual improvement. And just, you would do that for your business. You're spending a lot of money in this case, so make sure that you're actually getting the most bang for your buck. we talked a little bit about the governance and operational structure. It is a good idea to again make it known to the public to say how you've planned it and who's implementing it. And last but not the least, actually the targets that you're hoping to meet. Now, social development is very complex. It takes a long period of time. There are a lot of actors, a lot of players, just a lot of factors that are leading to poverty or malnutrition, or the absence of of healthcare. And but if you're able to actually wade through that complexity and identify very clearly what you are trying to change. So maybe you're trying to change something, and that something would typically have an indicator. So let's say you're trying to improve the quality of education, and therefore an indicator could be better attendance or improved retention, or a higher pass percentage. But to be very, very specific in terms of what are the goals that you're trying to achieve through CSR. And these goals can be a combination of your internal goals as a company, goals that you're expecting for a beneficiary, goals that you're expecting for an implementation partner. In terms of partnerships, again, you have the option of conducting a lot of your CSR programs internally. So you can do it using your employees, but you can also do it through external agencies, and these could be trusts or societies or Section 25 companies. These could be organizations that your company have set up, or it could be external organizations. But they do have to have an established track record of at least 3 years to implement the activities. Any expenses on experts or intermediaries are allowed, and companies can and should collaborate to actually create more impact. Again, like I said, your partners could be non-profits, they could be social enterprises, they could be experts, intermediaries. It goes back to the question of why you're doing it and report your business. How you can CSR, then it is important to keep the control within, and it is your employees that will probably undertake a lot of your CSR activities. If your focus is corporate philanthropy, and this is an area that that's not a core competence, or it's not something that you want to worry about on a day-to-day basis, then it is always better to outsource it to specialists. Okay, so let me just get a few more questions. So for an organization taking up a CSR activity, the change in mindset of all relevant stakeholders for process, I absolutely agree with that. And therefore the results will take more than a year, and that's absolutely true. And you just communicate it. So you say, let's say HIV, we will see it in your reporting framework where impact doesn't have to come through within a year. It is absolutely okay for it to take a long period of time. And it's also okay even as you start thinking about your stakeholders. The reason I said start with only a handful is because realistically within a year you're only going to be able to engage 2, 3, 4 or 5 stakeholders, nothing beyond that. And even once you work with them, these things just take time. Okay, so the next question, which is a 3 years track record. So has it just been in existence, or has it actually been working towards a specific goal for 3 years? We've asked the ministry for a clarification of that, and once we have it, we will communicate it to you. But from what it appears, I think track record just seems to be as long as they're doing an activity for 3 years. But hopefully we should get more clarifications around that. And I see it as sort of a gray area, because you can just set up an NGO and the NGO may be doing nothing for 3 years. Or you can set up an NGO and they might be doing a lot of work for 3 years, but they may just not have a 12-day certificate, which gets them, let's say, the non-profit status. So this is a perfect gray area, and we should have some insight on this. Okay, what percentage can be spent on consultants? Again, there's no clarification in terms of overhead costs or money spent on consultants. There is no cap, but I've heard something about some clarification being provided. We'll just have to wait and watch. So identifying partners. This is very critical again. So far again in our work, we've always heard of people talking about credibility. Now, I don't think credibility is enough to identify any partner, because what a credibility assessment will do is only to tell you that a certain NGO or a trust is actually compliant with the law and they're using your funds based on whatever promises that they have made. But that's not enough. And we've seen several examples of cases where a company has gone ahead with a very large, well-established NGO and realized that the NGO really doesn't care about the specific intervention that the company wants to support, and therefore there's a huge misalignment between what the NGO wants and what the company is expecting from them. So normally what we recommend is that compliance is like a hygiene check. It is important to ensure that whichever partner you select is transparent, it's in compliance with the law, that they have all the right set of documentation that's required. But beyond that, what you need to look out for is this organization capable of delivering whatever it is that you expect from them. So let's assume that you are a company that wants to roll out a financial literacy program, and let's say you want to roll it out in 3 different locations and your target group is, let's say, 3,000, then the question is this NGO or these set of NGOs capable of implementing this program in the 3 locations to the target audience that you've specified within a certain period of time, within a certain budget? And are these activities fully aligned with what they're already doing? We've seen so many instances of NGOs doing, let's say, education, who will say yes to a healthcare program just because the money is important to them, but then they end up struggling. It's not that they've made a false promise, it's just that they haven't thought through what they are and are not capable of implementing and what their core expertise is. And therefore, it really is up to you to ensure that you're selecting the right partner, and the partner and its management team have the bandwidth, the capability, the expertise, the willingness to actually deliver whatever you're expecting from them. We spend a lot of time on what you're seeing in the green box or sort of the bluish box and the purple box. We, for example, spend a lot of time with their donors, their partners, their volunteers, their beneficiaries to assess whether the NGO is capable of delivering a certain quality and at a certain price point. And then the last but not the least, again, is sort of the fit, right? Is this the right partner for you? You are going to be spending as part of your CSR activities every single year. Every year you don't want to go out and look for new partners. You really just want to identify 2, 3, 4 organizations that you're comfortable with, that buy into your vision, that understand what your goals and your priorities are, and that are able to work with you, your employees, your stakeholders to achieve certain common objectives. And therefore figuring out that alignment is extremely important. And if you do it once, and if you do it right, and if you keep up that relationship and there's an open line of communication between your implementation partner and your company, then you will, over a period of time, sort of smooth out or iron out all of the issues that you're facing. Again, it's not sort of a one-time activity. You can't just sort of say that I've figured out kind of my right fit. But it's something that you have to keep working on. But over a period of time, things become really easy. Both of you are able to achieve a certain level of alignment and comfort, and therefore moving forward it becomes much easier. Okay, so let me go back and take a few questions. So can a trust formed by the company itself, whose trustees are the senior management team of the company, be valid? Again, nothing in the rules that prevents this from happening. Actually, if you take a look at a lot of the corporate foundations, the directors of the company are also trustees of the NGO, the foundation. I know that there was some discussion around this a few months ago. I don't know if there's been any formal resolution to it, but I'm assuming that it's okay. I mean, I do see a conflict of interest, but it also ensures control over the CSR activities. Okay, next question. So if the NGO does not have an ATG exemption, can the company claim tax benefit? So you will not be able to claim any tax benefit, but I'm assuming that any expenditure that you actually incur on the NGO's activity or program, as long as it is part of your CSR policy, should be allowed. You may not get tax exemption on it, but it should be allowed under the CSR rules. The next question is, can an activity be split up? Oh, of course it can. So, in India, we don't really have that many NGOs that have a national scale or national presence. And for example, if your signature program is, let's say, girls' education, then you can identify different NGO partners across the country that are able to implement your program. Again, there are a few different options there. For example, you may, as a company, decide that you have a certain theory of change. So you think that to educate a girl or child effectively, you have to give her, let's say, 5 things. You have to give her a solid education, and you can define what that means. You can say that nutrition absolutely needs to be a part of a good education, and therefore nutrition can be part of the program. Let's say access to good sanitation facilities can be a part of the program. Access to things that go beyond education. So, for example, extracurricular activities can be a part of your program. And let's assume that even things like girls' empowerment can also be a part of the program. So let's assume that you have, as part of your signature program, you've said that I have a program for girl children that has 5 components. What you can then do is identify a set of, let's say, 10 NGOs in your different locations that have the ability to deliver the program. You may very well find that 9 out of the 10 don't deliver all the 5 components that you think are important, and therefore you will need to work with these 10 organizations to make sure that they're delivering the program that you think is the most relevant, obviously with inputs from them. They are the experts on the ground. They can come back and tell you that maybe 5 components is not right, maybe it should be 4, and maybe it should be delivered in a certain way. So that's a conversation that you need to have. But you can certainly go out and find partners that are more or less aligned with what you're trying to deliver. A role that we play as an intermediary is exactly that, because we find that what a company expects from its CSR initiatives is not something that existing NGOs are immediately capable of delivering. And therefore, there needs to be some sort of an orientation, training, capacity building, hand-holding that's required. And that's a role that experts or intermediaries can also play. Okay, so a few other questions. So what does the tax benefit mean to the company spending CSR as 2%? So again, I think a lot of people have asked the ministry for clarification to say that whatever money gets spent as part of the 2%, will that qualify as a tax deduction? That's a question that's been posed. I'm hopeful that there will be some clarification that will come out. Again, I think we will go ahead and communicate that as and when we receive it. Now just sort of a few more things in terms of even identifying the right partners. These partners don't always have to be external organizations. The same applies for internal partners or suppliers or vendors or other stakeholders that you're trying to engage. So again, capability is is very important to assess. Fit, again, is very important to assess. These could be partners that are helping you implement your activities. These could be partners that are helping you fund your activities. We've seen several instances where multiple companies will collaborate to achieve a certain goal. But it's also important to ensure that every donor that's part of the mix has the same values and the same priorities that you have. Okay, let me go back and take a few questions. If the company qualifies for CSR as per turnover but has no profit since the last 3 years, how are they expected to spend, or will they be exempted? Yes, I don't know actually. I think we'll have to figure out, because if there is no net profit number, then really how do you calculate what the company is supposed to spend? So let me think about that a little bit. If you can just send me that question separately, then let me figure out how that should be done. The next question is, how do you continue existing CSR activities? So actually, if your CSR activities qualify under this approach that you as a company will formulate and the CSR policy that you come up with, then you should absolutely sustain and even possibly expand your existing CSR activities. We highly encourage companies to do that for many reasons. One is the company has already started doing something. There's usually a good reason for why the company is doing it. There are a set of employees that are already motivated, that are already interested. You've identified certain partners. You've created certain impact. And if you're able to actually sustain it and expand it and support it, then by all means you should do it, as long as it comes under the definition of the CSR rules that have been specified. So just moving on to the next slide. What can your external implementation structure look like? So again, you have a CSR committee that reports into your board. The CSR committee oversees the work of an implementation group, which could, like I said, be internal or external. In terms of external partners, you could have NGOs or social enterprises. They could be trusts of other foundations. They could also be CSR consultants. And for example, there may be activities that are best done through NGOs or social enterprises, because they really have the most amount of expertise. We're also seeing companies actually being very comfortable supporting other corporate foundations instead of an NGO. And again, I think that comes with just the faith that they have in how certain corporate foundations are being run. And that also should be allowed as long as the 3-year criteria is met. You can also do your work through CSR consultants, and any expenses that you actually incur on them are allowed. CSR consultants are good if you have large budgets, if you're actually funding complex programs. It also gives you some breathing room to build up a team, to put in place certain processes, certain policies, certain strategies. Gives you time to actually recruit a team, train them, get them oriented. So we play the role of a CSR consultant, and most of our work, so the model that we follow is we will go in and work with a company for a year or two to ensure that they are fully compliant with the law, but also to really set up the processes, establish the partnerships, train the right set of internal and external staff, and really to get the ball rolling. And therefore, once the company has the time to kind of figure out the right governance structure, the right implementation structure, once they've identified the partners, once they are very clear about the stakeholders, the strategy, then it's easy enough, because kind of the hard work is done by an external consultant, and they have hopefully put in place processes that you yourself can carry on. Okay. moving on to monitoring and evaluation. Now the CSR committee itself is responsible to ensure that activities are being monitored and overseen. And therefore, even at the very beginning, once you have an approach in mind, once you have a policy in place, it is a good idea to think through every activity that you're undertaking and figure out what is the timeline, what are the deliverables, what are the milestones that you're expecting, but also what is the success criteria. When will you say that a certain activity has succeeded? And again, unlike kind of the business world, the social sector is complex. You can fund a lot of programs, you can support a lot of activities, but impact is very difficult to measure in several cases. But like I said, there will be some indicators which go beyond just the spend. So it's not just, am I spending this amount of money and am I spending it on time and am I kind of spending it on the right set of people. But beyond that, you should be able to define certain outcomes, and they could be, you could get some sort of numerical data on it. It may not be numerical. So, for example, things like, are you happy? Are you satisfied with a particular service, right? So, so sometimes there's a yes or no answer that's available. So, have you been immunized or no? It is also possible to measure things like hemoglobin levels in terms of, let's say, what you're targeting is, let's say, anemia. If you're targeting education, it is possible to measure learning outcomes. But if you're tackling other things, just a simple yes or no sometimes is also very helpful to ensure that you're kind of heading in the right direction. And the more clarity you have in terms of these outcomes, the better you'll be able to monitor and evaluate what you're doing. The CSR committee will obviously also be responsible to ensure that the allocated fund is only spent for the intended purpose. So, we're already hearing about lots of instances where other people are making demands from companies for CSR spend. And to a good way to counter that, and I'm not saying that it's always easy to counter that, is to say that, hey, our CSR policy has defined that we can only support these 3 things. So, just by law, I cannot support anything that doesn't look like these 3 things. So the clearer your policy is, the clearer your outcomes are, the easier it is to defend what you should and should not support. Having said that, you also want to make sure that your policy is flexible enough for you to change course if it's required. For example, you may end up saying that I want to support, let's say, vocational training in a certain community, and you may realize over a period of 1 or 2 years that that particular activity is not giving you the impact that you expected. Your policy should be loose enough for you to go back and modify it if required, or it should be just broad enough that it doesn't need modification. You can then pick something else under the area of, let's say, livelihood. And then the last is really about ensuring that you're also specifying how certain things should be executed. So is it going to be done by an internal team, by an external team? What are their deliverables? What are you specifically expecting from them? What are the timelines that you expect them to follow? The budgets that you expect them to actually, work within, or like I said, the outcomes that you're expecting. Let me just go back and again respond to the questions. Is it compulsory for the current financial year to implement CSR activities? So this year it's not required. Actually will become relevant in the year in the next financial year, so 14-15. Is there any tool or framework for it? Sorry, Mr. Rastogi, can you clarify what it means? So are you asking for something very specific in terms of a tool or framework? Okay, again, monitoring and evaluation. So it really depends on So there is no tool per se that the ministry has specified. While there has to be sort of broad kind of monitoring around how certain activities are conducted or how the money is spent, I think a very specific M&E tool will depend on what your activity is. So for example, if what you're supporting is a healthcare initiative, it will be very, very different from what we would need for an education initiative, and it will be very different from something that you do in environment. So what's important is to have like an overall monitoring and evaluation tool that's relevant no matter what CSR activity you choose. But it basically talks about sort of an over, how sort of it really talks about how the money is being spent. And then based on specific activities, you could employ different and more specific tools. Okay, going to impact assessment. So really, why should you measure impact? And when we started working, we thought that it was obvious to a lot of people that they need to measure impact. And yet, surprisingly, with all of our clients, the first item that gets cut out of a budget is impact assessment. But we really think it's very important. And for the simple reason that you should know what you're spending your money on. You should be very clear whether you're achieving the outcomes that you've set out to achieve. And actually measuring impact will help you plan better and make sure that you're using your money or whatever other resources you're committing more judiciously. It will also ensure that you're more accountable to your stakeholders. At the end of the day, a lot of these activities are being undertaken because because your stakeholders expect it, and therefore for you to go back to them and tell them exactly what activities you undertook, but then also what are the certain outcomes or impact that you ended up with. Impact measurement is also extremely important for future implementation or scale up. Again, we very strongly recommend that in the first year, there are clients really do pilots. If they have never done CSR programs before, then the first set of programs that they take on should really be pilot programs with a very clear impact assessment framework, because you want to know if whatever hypothesis you're actually coming up with are all of your assumptions justified or not. And then impact assessment is not just beneficial to you, but it's also important to communicate back to your final beneficiaries. So let's assume that you're trying to increase hemoglobin levels of, let's say, adolescent girls. Then it's also important to go back to them and say, hey, so when we did a baseline, we found that on an average your hemoglobin levels were, let's say, 8. And because of these programs that we've been running, it's now been so now we're seeing an increase at, let's say, 10 or 11 or 12. So very important to ensure that that you're actually communicating that. Now, what should you measure in impact? And we think that it's important to measure impact for every stakeholder that's involved. The first is, obviously the final beneficiaries. So how has their life changed because of the program that you're implementing and supporting? The second is, what is the impact on partners, your NGOs? And these could manifest in very different ways. It could manifest in an increase on the budget that they have. It could be the number of beneficiaries that they have been able to target. It could be an improvement in the quality of their program. It could be an improvement in, let's say, the depth of the program that they are able to offer, right? But also, what is the impact on your stakeholders? So let's assume that, let's say you're doing education programs and your employees are actually are helping you implement it. Then there are certain outcomes that you're expecting even from the employees. So are they more engaged? How do they view your company? Do they feel a sense of fulfillment and joy? Do they enjoy their work better? Have they learned skills that that they think are relevant for their day-to-day work, or just sort of their kind of overall career. So again, I think if you're able to, at the very beginning of your program, figure out how a certain program is going to impact, the various stakeholders, and if you're able to document it and track it, then, that's sort of the idea. Again, we find a lot of companies who start programs and then 2, 3, 4 years down the line, they'll say, oh, wait a minute, now let's start measuring impact. It becomes very difficult at that point in time because you don't really have a baseline. You don't know what happened before you start the program, and people tend to have short memories, and therefore you don't get the right data and you're not able to really measure the efficacy of something that you're doing. And last, but again, sort of very, very important, what is the impact on your business objectives? Again, this could be linked to profits, could be linked to growth. It may not be linked to anything, but it could just be sort of corporate philanthropy, but there may be certain goals that you've laid out. And have you been able to actually accomplish those? And therefore, the impact really has to be looked upon holistically, and kind of how it affects every stakeholder should be taken into account. So how do you really measure impact? Again, it will depend on the activity and the nature of program. But baseline and end-line surveys are very popular. So just before any intervention, you go in and work with your target beneficiaries to say, what are, let's say, income levels. So depending on what you're trying to impact. Let's say it's a livelihood program, then what you would typically go in and measure is what are their income levels, or what are their skill levels, or what are the employment opportunities that they're currently accessing. And after you implement the program, you can go back and check on the same indicators that you had measured before. So a baseline and line survey actually works very well in a lot of circumstances. The second is sort of a retrospective pre-test model. So this is really when you haven't done a baseline before, but you're able to go back and say, okay, so you go back to a beneficiary at a point in time and ask them, okay, so before this program, what did you do? And after the program, what happened? These are trickier because, like I said, beneficiaries tend to not remember things very well. There's a bias sometimes. There's a knowledge bias too that creeps in. Now you know something and you didn't know something earlier, and therefore the way you answer a question is very different. But again, like I said, I think you have to figure out what is the right way to measure impact. It can be, you can have a sample size. You can go ahead and measure kind of every beneficiary that you've touched. But so the ideal thing to do is to ensure that you're adopting certain sectoral or industry or program benchmarks that have been specified. Okay, so I see a question which says, should it not be pre and post impact assessment? So yes, that's ideal, but I think you should also assess impact over a period of time. So depending on what your program is, the impact becomes obvious in very different kind of time frames. So if you're doing vocational training and skill development, sometimes 3 months or 4 months is enough because you get somebody with no skills and let's say you teach them welding or plumbing, and within 3 months you're not just able to impart a skill, but you're also able to give them a job, and within 3 months it's easy to see kind of the before and the after effect. But things like education or healthcare, and particularly things like nutrition, etc. Just it takes time. You can do very quick things to measure impact, but a lot of these, so women's empowerment, for example, just takes time, and therefore what you want to do is set certain milestones and go and measure impact. Again, I don't recommend spending a huge amount of resources measuring impact. I used to work with the Poverty Action Lab, and I know our research budgets were sometimes almost equal to the program implementation budgets. I'm not recommending that level of sort of research. But if you're able to identify a sample size and if you're able to work with that, I think that should be helpful.
Should the impact be assessed at the end of each financial year? No, not necessary. Again, depends on your program. Some will have an annual cycle and others may not. But at the end of the financial year, if you're able to at least kind of communicate when was the last time you measured impact and what it was, I think that should be good enough. If you're able to put that into practice, that you will do an annual review, that's ideal and optimal. Also helps with reporting. Okay, so the next question, do you suggest doing pilot projects? Absolutely, yes. You will commit a lot of money, you will commit a lot of time and effort and expertise, and you want to know whether something is going to work or not. Having said that, there are certain things that are proven to work. So deworming pills work. Vaccinations work. So things that are proven, you don't really need an impact assessment to show that a certain intervention works. What you may need an impact assessment is, and again, it's not an impact assessment, but really a program evaluation, is to say that, are you delivering a certain program efficiently and effectively, right? So you should certainly measure that, but does deworming work is really not something that you need to measure at all, because it's proven to work globally. But let's say the impact on certain students, and let's say are they going to school a lot more? Are they complaining less of weight loss or fatigue? Those are useful things to measure and communicate. Like I said, it's good for the company, it's good for the beneficiaries. But pilot projects are a good idea, particularly as you start thinking about your signature programs before you really want to implement something at a national level or a state level or a city level. It is a good idea to do a pilot, keep it very controlled. It also gives you a sense of what's working and what's not. Okay, so the next question is, does providing energy access to rural communities come under CSR? It should. Again, you will have to define if providing that, if you as a business are getting any benefits from providing that energy access. So for example, if you put up like a plant to generate, let's say, electricity, then how much do you benefit vis-a-vis how much does the community benefit, and therefore how should that expenditure be split up? Should be considered. Okay. Okay, let me take the next question. Would you have an idea of how corporates would be interested in quality education programs? Impact for learning. So I don't fully understand the question. So would corporates be interested in supporting quality school education? I think the answer is yes. A large number of companies actually want to support education. And therefore, actually, measuring the quality of whatever education program that they're delivering is important. Yeah, so it's an interesting point, which is learning and not studying, which is, just being present in a classroom is not sufficient. That's no indicator of quality. And yes, so I think, a lot of the evolved companies are now looking at learning outcomes. And are not satisfied with just to say, does the kid attend the school or is the teacher in school, but actually figuring out is the child learning also becomes important. And then there are obviously ways to measure that. Okay, just coming to reporting. So what have the rules really said? That there should be a CSR report, which is a part of the annual report of the company. And what the CSR report should include are a few things. One is, what is the CSR policy of the company, right? So what is the statement of intent? Why are you doing it? What is your approach? What are the values that you're espousing? What are the broad areas of CSR interest? What are the causes that you plan to support? And what are the activities that you plan to undertake? But also, what is the target community? So is it girls? Is it for children? Is it, differently abled? So to ensure that you're providing some clarity in terms of who you're supporting and how you plan to support them would be very useful. The composition of the CSR committee needs to be specified. So whether you have 3 directors or more, the details of the independent director should be provided. Also, how do you plan to spend the CSR money? Oh, sorry. Can you still hear me? I just got a few messages saying you couldn't. Oh, okay, good. Yeah, so details of the CSR spend, and we'll see a reporting framework right after this, which talks about how you should report the CSR spend. Sorry, give me 1 second. If okay. So what are the details of the CSR activities? So one is, what is the amount that you're supposed to spend in a particular? So your 2% of average net profits over the last 3 years. What is the amount that has been carried forward from the earlier years? So what were you supposed to spend but haven't managed to do so, right? What is the amount that you plan to spend or this particular year? What have you actually spent, and what is the amount that needs to be carried forward in the next year? All of that needs to be clarified. The last is a responsibility statement that the CSR committee needs to put out, which talks about the CSR policy, whatever activities you plan to implement, what is the monitoring framework that you've put in place, and therefore how are you really compliant with the law. If you're able to specify all of that, I think that's ideal. Let me just respond to the question. Can this report be included in the parent company sustainability report? Yes, you can include it, but it has to be a part of your annual. It doesn't need to be a separate annual report. It just has to be part of your annual report. Okay. So what is the reporting framework? I think the first is really to ensure that you are providing details of the activities of the projects that you plan to undertake. The sector should ideally, be a part of the schedule. So if you can just link it to whatever is sort of the right cause that's been listed under Schedule 7. We'll wait for the final CSR rules to come out, but if there happens to be a clause which permits companies to decide anything that they want to support that goes beyond Schedule 7, if that comes into place, then you should specify what is the cause that you plan to support. So for example, if it's art or culture or sports. Where are, so which locations will these projects be implemented in needs to be specified. So both the local area as well as the district and the state. What is the budget, right? So, any budget that you have planned, which includes both the direct expenditure as well as the overheads that you plan to incur. Like I mentioned earlier, there is no cap on certain overheads, but if you're able to actually bifurcate the two, that would be helpful to say some of it is direct program expenditure and some of it is sort of other costs. What is the amount that you actually spend on the project? So this is different from what you are budgeting. Budgeting is sort of the previous column, and what you actually spend needs to be mentioned in this particular column. What have you spent cumulatively in the past up to this particular period also needs to be included. So the cumulative spend over the last few years. And then the last is how much have you spent directly through the company and how much of it is really through an implementing agency. So this is slightly different from direct expenditure versus overheads, and really goes towards kind of figuring out how many companies are directly spending the money and how many of the companies are outing it through an implementation agency. Okay, so I see a question which says, any idea when the final version of the law is to be out? I know that the IICA has submitted its final draft to the ministry. This was done a few weeks ago. We are expecting, something to be out in the public domain in the next few months. As soon as it's out, we can work with CII to ensure that that you get that you find out about it. Okay, so cumulative spend for how many years? Again, there is no specification, but ideally from the beginning of a certain activity would be helpful. So if you have existing CSR activities that you plan to support even going forward, then you're able to, then you should be able to say that, let's say we started something in 2008 and since then we've spent, let's say, X lakh rupees or X thousand rupees on it. Okay, so what happens if you don't comply? So one is if you haven't been able to spend the 2%, it would be helpful to clarify why you haven't spent it. There could be any number of reasons. And we discussed some of them earlier. Again, if you ask me what is a permissible response and what is not a permissible response, I don't think we know yet. But if you haven't been able to spend it, please go ahead and justify the reason. So it could be, that you thought that a certain implementation partner asked for X amount of money and then they found that the program got delayed and therefore the money itself was not spent. That's okay. If there is reporting default, so there is no penalty if you don't spend the money, as long as you're able to justify why you haven't spent it. But if you don't report, and if let's say your reporting format is incomplete, then both the company as well as a defaulting officer could be fined. And then the fine for a company is anywhere between 50,000 to 25 lakhs. And a defaulting officer can face up to 3 years imprisonment and may also have to put in a fine. So great question, who is the defaulting officer? Again, I don't think that there is clarity whether it is the board that will be held accountable, whether it is the CSR committee that will be held accountable, whether it is the implementation manager, whoever is responsible for implementation, who will be held accountable. But Section 134 actually talks about certain responsibilities that the board of directors have. And there they have mentioned that if the directors fail to comply with certain things, that they could be held accountable. So again, we've asked a few people about who qualifies under the defaulting officer. We haven't heard back yet. Once we do, like I said, if you're able to send me a list of questions that you haven't got a response to, then we'll try and do our best to get some sort of a response, or at least let you know where information is not available. So lots of gray areas, as we've seen, are listed 4, but in this conversation there were others that emerged. Will audit become mandatory? We don't know yet. What is the composition of spend? So, can you spend 90% of your money on CSR consultants and experts? I don't think that's right, but I don't know whether the ministry will come back with a cap. But given that your CSR report is going to be available to the public, anyone can point fingers at you at a company and say, hey, why did you spend 90% of your money on consultants or on staff, and why wasn't it actually spent on a program? So to avoid all of that, you want to ensure that you're maximizing the spend on beneficiaries. Although I think that enablers are very important for the first few years. You do want experts who can help you figure out the right programs, the right policies, the right strategies. And it's okay to say that in the first year or two that we're really kind of setting up things, and therefore a certain fraction of the budget has gone towards setup costs. But over a period of time, the amount of money that goes towards beneficiaries will increase. Does the corporate foundation itself need a track record of 3 years? It seems from the rules that the 3-year track record is required for the foundation as well as any other external partner that you decide to work with. Again, what 3 years specifically means is not clear. So is it from the date of incorporation? Is it from the date of the start of activities? Is it from the date that you received a 12A certificate or an 8AG certificate? All of that is not clear. We've asked for clarifications. What is the provision of CSR spend for a corporate foundation? Again, there have been questions around how much of it can go towards corpus, how much of it can go towards operating expenses of the foundation, how much of it will go towards the end beneficiaries. Again, there is no specific cap set. If we have more details, that will obviously be communicated. So those were the slides that I had for today. I'm happy to take any questions. If you want me to go back to certain slides and spend more time on them, I'm happy to do that too. Okay, so we have a question saying, will the New Companies Act exceed or overlook the global and national guidelines? These are very preliminary. I don't think we come anywhere close to the GRI guidelines or the ISO 26000, etc. But if your company already adheres to these guidelines, if you're able to ensure that whatever CSR activities you undertake are aligned with some of these global reporting requirements, then that's ideal. It also saves, sort of minimizes confusion within the organization. So do try and ensure that whatever you do to comply with the Indian law actually sinks in very well with your global reporting requirements. Let me just take these again. Okay, can you talk more about social enterprises and give examples? Okay, so social enterprises actually make great partners in a lot of cases. They make great partners when you have to deliver certain services that have the potential to become sustainable over a period of time, right? So let's say you're talking about delivering clean drinking water or energy or certain education support to a community. There is no reason why some of these cannot be chargeable over a period of time. So maybe in the first year you don't want to charge the community anything, but maybe in the second year you want to start charging a nominal fee. So particularly when it comes to service delivery, if you're able to identify social enterprises as partners, that's ideal, because you can then have an agreement with the social enterprise to say that we will commit to, let's say, setting up costs or operating expenses, or we will provide for customer financing for, let's say, the first 2, 3, 4, 5 years, beyond which time we expect you to continue to deliver these services to the community at certain sort of agreed upon prices. If you're able to enter into that kind of an agreement with social enterprises, they can be better suited compared to NGOs that you will have to fund, for years to come. So identifying social enterprises for service delivery, so energy, education, livelihood provision, vocational training, financial literacy. So these are sort of good models to look at. The CSR rules also allow you to partner with social enterprises. However, there are certain areas where you absolutely need NGOs. So things like empowerment or strengthening of, let's say, the community's ability to demand certain services from the government. All of these are issues, or when you're working with the very, very, very poor, where there is no way that you can charge them anything for the service. In a lot of these cases, NGO partners are the best bet. So just to give examples of social enterprises, like I said, Sarvajal provides water purification. There are companies that provide education support. The PAN IIT, for example, has a social enterprise called PAN IIT Reach for India that sets up vocational training institutes across the country to train local youth in things like plumbing, driving, mechanical work, etc. And they also ensure that these youth get placed in companies. So a lot of these are examples of social enterprises. Social enterprises can be for-profit as well as not-for-profit. And it depends entirely on how they are structured. But partnering with both for-profits as well as not-for-profits is allowed. Are education companies considered social enterprises? Well, again, it kind of depends. You know, much like CSR, there is no definition of social enterprise. It's, you know, when you see one, you know one. And you actually have to meet with the management to know whether they really are a social enterprise. So Samhita Social Ventures, the company that I started and run, so we're a for-profit company, but our only goal is impact, and therefore whatever profits we make, when we will start to make them, will actually get reinvested just to work with more companies and more foundations and more NGOs. So, you know, for example, our investors don't expect any return, and that's also something that a lot of social enterprises actually follow. Yeah, so you know, you'll see one when you know one, but again, kind of going back to the principles of finding the right partner, you want to make sure that that their priorities are aligned with yours. Moving on to the next question, hiring people from a certain function and providing them a qualification or a degree based education while on job is CSR. So, you know, if you're spending any money on employees, that's not going to be considered a CSR. Having said that, if you are spending money training a certain employee to do CSR work more efficiently, in the previous draft rules allowed for the training expenditure, so that could be allowed. Recommendations on the draft rules open? No, they're closed right now. Like I said, the IIC has already submitted its final list of recommendations to the ministry. The next question is, when should a private limited company appoint an independent director? So you don't need to appoint another person if you think that your existing board of, if there is an independent director within your existing board that you think can take on this function, then you know that's perfectly okay. But once you figure out what your overall approach is going to be, which stakeholders you want to target, which causes you want to support, at that point in time you may want an independent director who knows a lot more about a certain area. So for example, if you are an IT company and if you take on education as a core priority, and you know that's not something that that you as an organization are an expert in, what you could then do is go out and find an independent director who's an education expert who can help you plan and implement and oversee those activities. So I think the answer is, once you figure out the broad approach that you want to take and then the activities that you want to focus on, you know, that's a good time to figure out who the right independent director could be. The next question is on whether an Indian subsidiary of a foreign company will qualify. Yes, so you know, any company that meets those three requirements will qualify. And then, can the foundation created by the parent foreign company fund the program if the Indian company has no profit? So can the foundation created by the parent company? It can. What we will have to ensure is that so any money put in by the foreign company will qualify under FCRA, so it's foreign contribution, and therefore your implementing partners have to have FCRA to be able to accept that money. I think that's what you'll have to pay attention to. Any handbooks provided on the session? No, the presentation will be shared. There are no handbooks beyond that, but like I said, if you have any questions, we're happy to answer them in greater detail. Okay, the next question is, can you provide clarity on the role of a company CSR foundation versus the individual CSR programs of group companies in terms of spend? So typically when there is a group company and when there are certain companies within it that qualify for CSR, for the CSR spend, having a foundation is actually a good idea. It allows you to pool in money from different companies. You know, we've seen examples of where there's one particular company that is making significant profits and therefore has a huge amount of spend that they're able to make, but they don't really have any immediate stakeholders that they are trying to impact. Whereas there might be another company, even within the group company, that you know, maybe has is still making losses or is making minimal profits, but that has an obligation towards the community in which they work in, and therefore have to spend money, not because it's mandated by law, but because you know, that's required from the community. In that case, actually having a foundation where you can pool in the money is very beneficial, so that the kind of the company making the significant profits can show the spend, as long as they are able to identify the beneficiaries very clearly, and then the company that's actually not, that doesn't have you know, that much money to spend but has that need, can be shown as the company that's kind of implementing it for the community. So yes, actually having a foundation helps significantly in terms of pooling. Okay, so I have a request to spend a few more minutes on slide 8, 9, 10. So let me go back to those slides. Okay. So let's go back to the stakeholder slide. Like I said at the very beginning, your approach and your stakeholders are the two things that will really determine your overall CSR strategy. And therefore, if you're able to go back and kind of list down all of the stakeholders that are critical to your business, then that's sort of the first place to start. You know, we highly recommend that you draw up the internal list first, that you prioritize your stakeholders, that you have some broad thoughts around your CSR approach before you go out and engage them, for the simple reason that even at the beginning of your CSR strategy or approach, it's the first thing that you go and ask the community or ask your employees, you will get responses that are not relevant. So for example, we were talking to a fairly large IT company, and what the company said is, they said, hey, you know, so employees are our sort of primary stakeholder. So first, before even the senior management decides, let's go and ask the employees. So what they did is did this large employee survey, lots of communication around it. And what they heard is that the employees wanted to support old age homes. Now the senior management at that point in time didn't know what to do, because they said, hey, you know, as an IT company, we have no expertise, no understanding of what senior citizens want. And yet that's something that our employees want to support. But they also thought back and they realized that actually supporting senior citizens is not a core priority. It's, you know, just they have no expertise, no understanding, no domain knowledge. And therefore they said, look, we can give money, but beyond that, what else can we do as a company for senior citizens? And therefore they realized that sort of the mistake that they made was to go out and ask employees what they wanted without providing some direction, some guidance, right? And so what we recommend is first, if the senior leadership can sit together and figure out who your key stakeholders are and what you think their priorities are and what the issues that affect them are, then first make a list of that and then go to your stakeholders and tell them, okay, so this is what we broadly want to support. This is what we may or may not be able to support. And under this context, now tell me what you think that very specifically you need. And you know, that makes expectation setting a lot easier, because then you're setting boundaries as to what you can and cannot do, what you can and cannot support, and therefore you're still going out and engaging your critical stakeholders. You're still giving them the ability to voice their opinion and their needs, but you're giving them some sort of a boundary so that you know, they are able to come back to you with something very specific instead of kind of something very, very broad that cannot be achieved. once you've heard back from your stakeholders, it is important to go back and say, look, out of, let's say, the 40 things that we've heard, realistically, what are the 2 or 3 things that we can do? It can't be more than 2 or 3 things. You will have a limited budget. This is not what you do, as on a day-to-day basis, and therefore, you will have to identify the 2 or 3 things where you can truly make an impact. And it is important to go back and communicate with the stakeholders, hey, so, we followed this process, we heard you guys out, this is what we heard from you, we've thought about it, and we're coming back to you and saying, these are the 2 or 3 things that we can support over the next 3 or 4 years. Beyond that, we're happy to take suggestions, and we're happy to keep this sort of an ongoing dialogue so that you continue to tell us what's working and what's not for you. If you're able to actually follow that strategy, that's ideal, because you've kept an open line of communication, you haven't shut anyone down, you're open for dialogue, and yet you are establishing certain ground rules in terms of what you're able to support. Second, if you're able to actually engage them, that's very powerful, right? If you're able to create a sense of ownership within your employees, within the community, within your customers, so that they can really become your champions, they can provide the support that you cannot provide. A lot of the social issues that we deal with as a country are so large and so complex that no single company or no single organization, NGO, is able to really tackle it with any kind of significant impact. And therefore, the more collaborators that you're able to get onto the table, the better it is. But you have to remember that this is your CSR initiative, and in some sense, you are the anchors for it. And therefore, you should be very clear about what you plan to support, who do you want on board, what are the values that all of your partners need to abide by, and having that kind of clarity would be would be very useful. Just moving on to the next slide. Okay. Again, so like I said, have, let's say, let's assume that your CSR budget is 10 lakhs. If you're able to set aside 5 or 6 lakhs for a signature program, some money for your planned projects, and then a little bit of money, very little, but some money for unplanned activities. So you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you say, oh, oops, I spent all my money and now I have nothing to give for a national disaster or something else that, let's say, your community is expecting from you. So very quickly, again, a signature program is a holistic program that you want to support over a period of time. So there are certain criteria. You have to make a medium to long-term commitment. It needs to be something that you will become known for, so it will become, it will sort of get married with your brand identity and with the way people look at you. The more collaborators you're able to get on board, the better it is. Again, it doesn't have to be a program that's built upon your core competence, but if it is, then it's even better, because you can really kind of create transformational change. But pick a cause, either something that's completely aligned with your business, something that you know a lot about, something where you can truly create change, or pick a program where you're still able to leverage your business competencies to create significant change in an area that you may not know a lot about, but something that you can champion over a period of time. Planned programs are really those that your stakeholders are demanding from you. These are very specific programs in education, livelihood that may have nothing to do with your core competencies, but these are things that that your stakeholders really need. It could be a water purification plant that your communities want. It could be access to livelihoods. It could be access to certain skills that they're expecting from you. Ideally, doing this over the medium or long term is a good idea. Communicating back to them what you're doing for them is a very good idea. So we've talked a lot about the CSR policy. Let me go back and take your questions and come back to this. How do you strategize CSR in line with business? Can you give examples? Sure. Okay. So take an example of Novartis. What Novartis did is they said that leprosy, and this was sort of done many years ago, they said leprosy is a cause and we are going to champion, and we are going to put the might of our business behind it. So yes, we will give money as part of our CSR spend, but what we're also going to do is really leverage the core competencies of our employees, of the doctor network, the pharmacy network that we have, and really sort of the customer base that we have. And what they went out is they went and found implementation partners who were specialists in leprosy. They formed a large number of very strategic partnerships with the government, with international organizations, with local organizations, and developed a set of programs that they thought would be very successful in leprosy, and really sustained the support for that cause over a long period of time. So, for example, if you're let's say if you're an IT company and what you understand best is IT, then what you do is you go out there and identify, let's say, IT as a cause and talk about, let's say, computer literacy, or or sort of very specialized IT literacy that you're able to impart to, let's say, the youth, and therefore make them more employable, right? So identify areas that kind of fit in with your core area of business. We've seen examples of Nike kind of realizing that there was a huge backlash, just knowing that kind of so they had given out contracts to smaller suppliers and producers of their garments, but these suppliers and producers were not didn't have the sort of the best working conditions, and therefore the women or the women that were manufacturing these garments for Nike were really linear treated. And therefore what Nike did is actually went back and ensured that their supply chain became ethical, and that all of their suppliers, their producers, the garment manufacturers, etc., put in place certain policies to ensure that that the workers were being treated well. So these are not your employees. These are not even your contract workers. You could go back and say that that's a community that we really care about. So completely depends on sort of your business orientation. Once you do your stakeholder mapping, you can identify the 2 or 3 areas that are critical to the functioning of your business. It could be a risk mitigation strategy, it could be a business development strategy, but identify 2 or 3 areas where you really can create a significant difference. Moving on to the next question, is there a breakup of the 2% mandated that it needs to be split on social enterprise and NGOs? No, there is no breakup that's been given. Like I mentioned earlier, you might see some guidelines around some caps on overhead costs, but we'll have to wait and watch. No, but there is no breakup. Can money invested for financial inclusion by a commercial bank be considered as a CSR initiative? That's a good question. But I think the RBI has already laid down certain guidelines about what you need to do around financial literacy or financial inclusion. So that money has to be spent. Can it be counted towards CSR? If you can send me that question, let me check. So let me check with the other banks in terms of how they're looking at it, and then we can also check with the ministry how they would view this. But I think what they have been very clear about is if there is another regulatory norm that requires you to spend certain money on certain initiatives, you can't count money spent on those initiatives as part of your CSR. But I can go ahead and check if this is also included. Who can be an independent director? So it can be any individual who you think is qualified to assume the post of a director. Like I said, there's no sort of criteria around education or experience, but really somebody who you think can do justice and can bring in an outsider's perspective and an unbiased perspective to your CSR initiatives would be a good independent director. Is there a credit rating for companies or NGOs set up by the government? No, there are organizations that rate NGOs. We're not big advocates or fans of credit rating of NGOs for the simple reason that a credit rating is usually at a point in time. It talks about credibility. It really doesn't talk about the fit. It doesn't talk about capability, and therefore it is one of the many factors that you can consider when you select an implementation partner, but it can't be the only criteria that you consider. There is talk of setting up a CSR index that would provide some sort of rating to companies. So again, we'll have to see what are the different initiatives that emerge. But it's complex to also say that there should be a credit rating because again, different companies may take on different strategies, and it is kind of difficult to say what is the specific impact that a particular company has achieved, or do they leverage their core competencies of their stakeholder network very well. Okay, so the next question, which is around where monitoring is concerned when dealing with patients and patient privacy and confidentiality issues, how should feedback and impact measurement be done? So you have to follow all of the guidelines around privacy of beneficiaries or patients. But as long as you're able to do anonymous surveys where you don't take specific individual details or anything that helps you kind of recognize a certain individual, feedback surveys can still be done. They have been done in the past, and that's a good way of doing it. The government is not asking you to really disclose any kind of confidential information on any individuals or any organization, and so you don't need to do it. But the impact assessment is also kind of for your benefit. If you're able to do it anonymously, then that's helpful. Okay, so the next question is that the parent company sponsors many projects. Can we include the spend under this head rather than in spending money from individual subsidiaries? I'm afraid not. I think every company that becomes liable have to spend the money. So saying that a parent company can spend on your behalf may not be permitted. The next question is around, I see that Mr. John has left. Does a foreign foundation CSR spend in India be considered or showcased spend around according to the Act? So again, I'm not clear whether the foreign foundation is based in India or not. So we'll have to, so we'll have to see. But it needs to be an Indian entity and it needs to be spent on India. Again, just because a foreign foundation associated with your company is spending money doesn't mean that your company, if it is liable to spend, should not be spending. You shouldn't be spending. Any compounding procedure available on voluntary delayed disclosure or reporting? So nothing, there have been no clarification around any compounding procedures. We'll just have to wait and watch. But if you take a look at the reporting framework, it does allow you to keep aside some money that you haven't been able to spend and spend it in the next few years. Is there a simplified list of the rules? So I don't know what you mean by that. The rules are available. We can circulate the copy. It is actually pretty simple. The issue with the rules is that they are a little too simple, and therefore a lot of the clarifications that we need are not present. Is there any limit for NGOs? So, Mr. Prasanna, can you expand on that? What do you mean by limit for NGOs? Okay, the next question is around fundraiser events that come under the CSR purview. Again, I would need a little more clarity on that. So what does a fundraiser event mean? You can go ahead and organize fundraisers and spend the money from those fundraisers on your CSR activities. As far as the money that is actually spent on the fundraiser itself, can that qualify under CSR? I'm really not sure, but maybe if you can deduct the money that you've spent on the fundraiser, and hopefully the money that you raise is more, and that money can go towards CSR. is not the public at large or the community an important stakeholder? It is. It is an important stakeholder, absolutely. But it's difficult to figure out what that particular stakeholder is expecting from you. If you're able to do that and if you're able to get clarity, then that's great. But a lot of companies, for example, will do something that's for the public benefit without really identifying a very specific issue, and that's perfectly all right too. So the role of media is an important stakeholder. So that the media becomes very, very critical. It becomes critical from various perspectives. It's critical as a watchdog to ensure that that companies are actually, sort of following the CSR rules and the guidelines. As you know, there is no audit per se that's required, and therefore the media can play an important role in ensuring that the company is complying, with whatever requirements. The media can also look at things like, how much are you spending on consultants or staff as opposed to programs itself. So yeah, I think the role that it can play, both as a watchdog, but also as a promoter of certain initiatives that a company is supporting. So for example, if your company wants to support, let's say, a behavior change campaign that's relevant for the nation as a whole, let's say you're funding things like nutrition, vaccination, breastfeeding, then the media can also play a very critical role in taking that message out to the masses. So engaging them becomes very, very critical. So the next question is, should the company not focus? Should the company's focus be on increasing its employee involvement in CSR activity? Absolutely. I think it also depends on, there are proven benefits to say that if you are able to engage your employees effectively, they're just more committed to your company, they work harder, they just care more about their day-to-day activities. There have been studies that show that, employee volunteering also leads to an improvement of the skills. It improves just the relationship or the rapport that they share with their co-workers. So there are lots of benefits to actually engaging employees. The trick is in kind of doing it smartly, right? So if you're able to ensure that your employees' passions and their energies are also focused in meeting your CSR objectives, that's sort of the win-win that you want to aim for. Okay, next question. I found from experience that unless some hype is created periodically on what all has happened on CSR front, activities will peter out. I completely agree, right? I'm not in favor of the word hype, but you're right. I mean, if you're doing something good, and if you want to get other people to support it, if you want other champions, then absolutely going in and talking about what you're doing, creating very specific requests for help, is a really great way of not just, sort of sharing the message, but also getting a lot of other collaborators on board and therefore increasing kind of the impact of your CSR activities. So I wouldn't say hype, but by all means, absolutely go out and communicate as often as possible to tell people and to enlist other supporters. The next question is CSR in line with business and CSR in line with MDGs. How do you comply with both options? Yeah, so for example, just going back to the example that I had stated of, let's say, a pharma company looking at, or take a company looking at, let's say, malnutrition among infants. Assume that you're a Nestle or you're a company that actually focuses on infants. What you can do is go out and do, let's say, a large breastfeeding campaign. It's a great way to engage your customers, but it's also a great way to actually further a Millennium Development Goal and ensure that sort of new mothers are following breastfeeding practices. So as long as you're able to identify an activity which which is sort of compliant with the Millennium Development Goals. But and companies have to think hard. It's not easy. I think for some companies it's easy to find an obvious fit. If you're a pharma company, if you are somebody that's talking about livelihood or agriculture, that you have a large manufacturing base, it's easy to figure out activities. But let's say you're a consulting firm, how do you then pick something that, how do you pick a cause that's relevant for your line of business, right? So it's not always easy, but with a little thought, I think it'll become obvious in terms of the role that your company and your employees can play. If the company is present pan-India, should the spending be proportionate? Not necessary at all. What you need to do is identify which region or which community you think needs to be most impacted, and you can distribute your money accordingly. For example, you may find that let's say you're spending on, let's say, education across let's say 14 locations that you have. What you can do is identify the 2 or 3 locations where the need is the most critical and focus your spending on those locations. In the rest of the locations, you can do some activity if required. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be equally spent, but I would go with what you think is the most critical and what's most urgent and which communities need your support the most. Can scholarships given to employees' children be considered a CSR? So the current draft rule that's available says that it cannot be considered. So anything for employees and their families is not allowed. But we can wait for more clarification to come out. It looks like we've run over time. If you can send me all of the questions that you think have not been responded to, and we will try and do our best to respond to some of them and circulate that. I thank you very much for really taking the time. 2 hours is a lot of time to spend on a subject like CSR. I've enjoyed talking to the screen. I wish I'd met you in person. But thank you very much to CII for setting this up, and thank you to all of you for being, such an engaged audience. I'm happy to take any questions beyond this. Just send me an email, and I will get back to you in the next week or so. Thanks.
The organizer has ended the session.